The last thing Delbert Pruitt loaded into the 1954 Chevy on his final morning at Omaha Steelworks was a coffee mug, ceramic white with a hairline crack running from the handle that he had never bothered to fix because it did not leak, and a cracked mug still held coffee just fine. He had used it every workday for 19 years. He wrapped it in a shop rag, set it on the passenger seat, and sat behind the wheel for a moment before starting the engine. It was June of 2010. He was 62 years old. In 20 minutes, he would walk out of that plant for the last time after 41 years, and the only vehicle in the parking lot that had been there longer than he had was the one he was sitting in. A younger coworker named Dennis leaned against the doorframe of the break room, watching Delbert through the window. Dennis drove a 2009 Silverado bought on a 5-year loan, and he was the kind of man who replaced his truck every time the payments ended. He called out, "You're really driving that thing to the cabin, all the way to Scotts Bluff." Delbert turned the key. The inline-six caught on the first try, same as it had every morning for 18 years. "She's made that trip before," Delbert said. Dennis shook his head the way young men do when they think patience is the same thing as stubbornness. Delbert pulled out of the lot, and the Chevy carried him away from Omaha Steelworks for the last time the same way it had carried him there every morning since 1992. But to understand how that truck came to be in that parking lot and why it mattered, you have to go back to a Saturday afternoon in June of 1989 to a gravel lot outside of Omaha where a crowd of men were laughing. Not polite laughter, the kind that carries across an open yard and makes strangers stop walking to find the source. Delbert Pruitt was standing at the payment table counting out 15 $20 bills, and he was not laughing. He was 41 years old that summer, a machinist at Omaha Steelworks, going on 19 years, a man who had spent his life around engines the way other men spent their lives around ledgers or courtrooms. He had his father's hands wide across the palm and rough at the knuckle, and his father's way of moving through the world, which was to say he moved slowly and with purpose and did not waste effort on things that did not need doing. The truck he had just paid $300 for sat at the back of the Douglas County equipment auction lot, separated from the decent vehicles like a patient nobody wanted to treat. The paint had gone from Chevy blue to something closer to primer gray. Both tires on the driver's side were flat. The passenger door hung open at a wrong angle, held by a single hinge. Birds had built a nest somewhere in the cab. And on the dusty windshield, someone had written the word "runs" in the grime, followed by 3 question marks that communicated everything you needed to know about the confidence behind that claim. The auctioneer had nearly skipped it. "All right, folks, coming to the end here. 1954 Chevy pickup, part of the Drummond estate, hasn't run since looks like 1971, based on the expired plates. Sold as is, no guarantee. Probably better for parts than anything else." Do I hear 100? Silence. 50, more silence, and then a few chuckles. 25 for a genuine piece of Americana. Delbert raised his hand. 100. The auctioneer looked up, surprised. "I have 100. Do I hear 150? Nothing. 100 going once." Then Delbert said 200. People turned to look. A man bidding against himself for a truck that had not run since Nixon was in the White House. "Sir, you don't need to bid against yourself." Delbert said 300, and that was when the real laughter started. "Sold," the auctioneer said quickly before Delbert could take it higher. "To the gentleman in the back for $300. Orville Breckett had been standing beside Delbert through all of this. Orville was 39, a line operator at the same steel plant, and he had driven Delbert to the auction that morning with the understanding that they were looking for a gearbox for Chester Pruitt's old Dodge, not a truck that hadn't run in 18 years. Not $300 in cash. When Delbert raised his hand the first time, Orville thought it was an accident. When Delbert bid 200, Orville put his hand on Delbert's forearm. Delbert did not look at him. He looked straight ahead at the truck. Orville took his hand away. They did not speak much on the drive back. The Chevy would have to be towed. It could not roll on 2 flat tires and almost certainly could not be started even if the tires held air. They had arranged for a flatbed, and it followed them out of the lot with the Chevy strapped down on the back, the old truck riding high above the road, like something being transported to a museum rather than a garage in Council Bluffs. After about 10 miles, Orville said, "Why?" Delbert was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of a man avoiding the question, the silence of a man locating the honest answer. "It looked like it had been waiting a long time," he said. "Waiting for what?" "I don't know yet. Orville looked out to the window at the flat Nebraska landscape. You know Thelma's going to love this. Delbert said nothing because there was nothing to say. Before we follow Delbert home, you need to understand who he was. Not the surface of him, the job title, the age, the address, but the interior. Because a man's decisions only make sense when you know what built him. Delbert grew up in Council Bluffs, Iowa, just across the Missouri River from Omaha. His father, Chester Pruitt, had been a maintenance mechanic at the Swift and Company meatpacking plant for 32 years, a man who believed in three things without reservation: honest work, reliable tools, and fixing what you had instead of buying what you wanted. The Pruitt household was not poor, but it was careful, and there was a difference between those two things that Delbert understood by the time he was 12. What Chester taught Delbert, he taught not through lectures, but through presence. He brought Delbert into the garage the way other fathers brought sons to ball games. Not to watch, but to participate, to understand, to develop the particular patience that mechanical work requires. There was one evening Delbert returned to, often without meaning to, the way certain memories surface when you least expect them. Delbert was 20 years old. It was a Tuesday in October in 1968, nearly 11 at night, and Chester appeared in the doorway of Delbert's room and said only, "Come down to the garage." Not a question. Chester walked out and Delbert followed because you did not need reasons with Chester Pruitt. In the garage, Chester had already spread newspaper across the workbench and set out two lights. On the bench was the carburetor from his 1947 Dodge pickup, which ran perfectly fine. Chester began disassembling it with the methodical calm of a man performing a familiar ritual rather than a repair. Delbert watched. Then Chester handed him a tool without a word, and Delbert began helping. They worked until 2 in the morning. When they were done, the carburetor was reassembled and the Dodge still ran perfectly fine, exactly as it had before. Delbert finally asked what had been wrong with it. Chester set his tools down, wiped his hands on a rag, and said, "Nothing. I needed to work on something tonight." A pause, then, "Machines don't look down at you. Whatever happened at work today, whatever anybody said or didn't say, a machine doesn't know about it. You put in honest work, and it runs. You treat it right, and it holds. Machines don't break that deal." He hung the rag on its hook. Remember that. Delbert never forgot it. Chester died in 1978, a heart attack in March, 61 years old. Delbert was 30. He inherited the garage, the tools, and the 1947 Dodge, with 340,000 miles on it, which ran perfectly. He still drove that Dodge in 1989, maintaining it with the same schedule. Chester had kept oil every 3,000 miles, valves checked annually, nothing deferred. So when Delbert stood in the back of that auction lot and looked at the 1954 Chevy, he did not see what the laughing crowd saw. He saw the same inline-six engine his father had taught him to work on. He saw a machine that had been built well and then abandoned, and those two things were in his understanding of the world incompatible. Things that were built well did not belong in the back of a lot with question marks written on the windshield. He saw a wrong that could be set right. He went home to explain this to his wife. Thelma Pruitt was 38 that summer, a woman of considerable patience who had spent 14 years of marriage learning the particular landscape of her husband's silences. She knew which silences were contentment and which were concentration and which were the kind that meant he had already made up his mind about something and was simply preparing the words. She had recognized the third kind in his face the moment he came through the door. She did not speak first. She poured 2 cups of coffee, set them on the kitchen table, sat down and waited. Delbert sat across from her. He placed the receipt on the table between them. She looked at it. She looked at him. She picked up her coffee and set it back down without drinking. "The washing machine money," she said. "Yes, you promised." "I know." She was quiet for a moment, not angry in the way of raised voices. Thelma's anger was precise, which made it harder to deflect. "Delbert, this is the 3rd time." She did not need to list the other times. The radio chassis in 1984, which had taken 8 months in a corner of the living room. The boat motor in 1987, which had taken 16 months in the entirety of the back porch through 2 winters. And now this. "An entire truck," she said. "The frame is solid." "The frame. Everything else can be replaced. If the frame is solid, the truck can be saved." Thelma looked at him for a long time. This was one of the things Delbert valued most about her. She did not talk to fill silence. She sat with information until she understood it. "Why this truck?" she said finally. Delbert considered the question. There was the honest answer and the easier answer, and he had never been good at choosing the easier one. It was sitting at the back of that lot, separated from the other vehicles, like something that had been given up on. He paused. I don't think things that were built well should be given up on. Thelma was quiet, then, are you talking about the truck or something else? Delbert did not answer that. He wasn't sure he could. After a long moment, Thelma stood, poured her coffee out, rinsed the cup, and set it in the rack. With her back still to him, she said, I'm not going to stop you, but this time you finish it. She turned around. And you buy the washing machine before the end of next month. All right. I mean it, Delbert. I know you do. She looked at him one more moment, then walked out of the kitchen. It was not forgiveness exactly. It was something more durable than forgiveness, which was the decision to stay in the room with a person even when they frustrated you, because the frustration was part of the whole, and the whole was worth keeping. Delbert sat at the table a while longer, then went out to the garage to begin. He was not the only one who had witnessed the scene at the auction. Eldon Cantrell had found him at the payment table while the laughter was still traveling across the lot. And what followed was a conversation Delbert would carry with him for years, not because it wounded him, but because it clarified something he had suspected about the distance between certain kinds of men. Eldon Cantrell was 38, the owner of Cantrell Ford in Omaha, the largest truck dealership in Douglas County. He wore pressed khakis and a polo shirt with the dealership logo embroidered on the chest, and a gold watch that caught the afternoon sun in a way that seemed less accidental than intentional. He drove a new 1989 F-150 XLT Lariat, which he replaced every year, and he had the salesman's gift for making conversation feel friendly while moving it steadily toward a close. Delbert and Eldon were not strangers. They had attended the same high school in Council Bluffs 2 years apart in the early 1960s. Eldon had been the kind of student who always had the newest thing, the sharpest clothes, the car that other kids talked about. Delbert had been the kind of student who fixed other people's cars. In 1975, Eldon had hired Delbert to rebuild a transmission and had taken 3 months to pay him, explaining each time that he was very busy getting the dealership off the ground. Delbert had not asked twice. He had waited, accepted the money when it came, and filed the information away the way you file away a fact about someone's character, not with judgment, just with accuracy. Eldon did not remember that. Delbert had no expectation that he would. At the payment table, Eldon came toward him with his hand extended and his voice already pitched at the volume of a man who wants a small crowd. Delbert Pruitt, tell me you didn't just spend $300 on that pile. I did. Delbert. Eldon looked at the receipt, then at Delbert, then put a hand on his shoulder in a gesture designed to communicate concern. That truck hasn't run in nearly 20 years. The engine is seized. The wiring is shot through. You just paid $300 for about $50 in scrap. Maybe? There's no maybe about it. I've been selling trucks for 15 years. I know what I'm looking at. The hand on the shoulder did not move. Listen, come by the dealership Monday. I've got a 1989 F-150 already on the lot, used good shape 4 to 500 on a 36-month note. You could be driving something that actually runs by Tuesday. Delbert looked at Eldon's hand on his shoulder, then at Eldon's face, then at the truck in the back of the lot. I appreciate it, he said, but I'm keeping the truck. Eldon shook his head, still smiling, but something behind the smile had shifted slightly, the way a salesman's expression shifts when a deal he expected to close doesn't. Your funeral, buddy. He dropped the hand. Just remember I tried to help. He walked back to his F-150, climbed in, and drove away with the air conditioning running and the radio playing. Delbert stood there for a moment. Then he went to sign the title transfer. On the drive back, Orville watched the Chevy in the side mirror of his truck riding high on the flatbed behind them. Eventually, Orville said, you know what his problem is? Whose one? Cantrell, you know what actually bothers him? Delbert said nothing, which Orville had learned years ago was his way of indicating he was listening. It's not the truck, Orville said. He doesn't care about the truck. It's that you're the kind of man who doesn't need what he's selling. That makes guys like him uncomfortable. They build their whole sense of things around the idea that everybody needs the newest version. You walk away from that, and it breaks something in their logic. Delbert thought about that for a while. Then he said, he told me my father died in a rented house with $400 in his account. Orville was quiet for a moment. He said he respected Chester, but that I didn't need to follow that path. Orville looked straight ahead at the road. What did you say? Nothing? Good. But I thought about it. Orville glanced at him, and Delbert watched the flat Iowa landscape going by. My father fixed machines his whole life. He left me a garage full of good tools and a truck with 340,000 miles on it that runs perfectly. That's not failure. That's just a different kind of math. They drove the rest of the way in silence. It was a comfortable silence, the kind that only exists between people who have known each other long enough to stop filling space with words. That first week, Delbert assessed the damage. He was thorough and systematic about it, going over the truck, section by section, making notes in a small spiral pad in his cramped, even handwriting. It took 5 days. The engine was seized, the pistons locked in the cylinders by 18 years of rust in dried oil. The wiring harness had gone brittle throughout, cracked at every bend. The brake lines were rusted through in multiple places. The cab floor was soft in 2 spots where moisture had worked its way in from a leaking seal. The truck bed had small holes from surface rust that had gone too long without attention. But the frame was solid. Delbert knew this because he checked it the way Chester had taught him, lying on his back under the truck with a flashlight in one hand and a ball-peen hammer in the other, tapping at the steel in a slow, deliberate pattern. The sound a hollow frame makes is unmistakable. A thin metallic ring that tells you the rust has eaten through the walls of the steel. A solid frame answers back with a dull, definite knock. Every point Delbert tested answered back with that knock. He lay under there for a full minute after he was done listening to the quiet of his garage, before he rolled out and stood up and wrote one word at the top of the first page of his notebook: workable. There was a moment while he was in the garage that evening that he did not tell anyone about. He was looking for a clean notebook in the cabinet above the workbench, and he opened the wrong drawer and found one of Chester's maintenance logs, a small green booklet from 1975. He opened the cover and saw his father's handwriting, the same cramped even script that Delbert had inherited without realizing it, recording oil changes and valve adjustments in mileage intervals in the Dodge. He stood there for a moment with the booklet in his hands. Then he closed it, set it carefully back in the drawer, and took a new notebook from the shelf below. Some things you carry alone, not because you are hiding them, but because they belong to a private place inside you where words do not quite reach. The following Saturday, Orville came by the garage. He stood in the doorway for a while, looking at the state of things. Engine components were laid out on sheets of newspaper across the garage floor, each piece labeled in marker with a small tag. Electrical components on the workbench to the left, organized by circuit, hardware sorted by type in shallow trays. The spiral notebook sat open on a sawbuck near the door, its pages already dense with measurements and observations. Orville walked the perimeter slowly, hands in his pockets. Then he stopped near the door and looked at Delbert. "How long?" he said. "I don't know." "You think it'll run?" "I don't know yet." Orville was quiet for a moment. He crouched down and picked up one of the engine components from the newspaper, turned it over in his hands, set it back exactly where it had been. He stood up. "Can I help take the rest of it apart?" Delbert looked at him. "Why?" Orville considered the question directly. "Because you're the only man I know who says I don't know and doesn't mean he's going to quit." He looked around the garage. "And because somebody should be here for this." They worked until past 9 that evening. When Thelma came to the garage door with 2 glasses of iced tea, she set them on the workbench without a word and went back inside. Delbert watched her go. Orville watched Delbert watching her. "She's all right," Orville said. "Not yet," Delbert said, "but she will be." Orville picked up his glass. "You sure about that?" Delbert picked up his own glass, took a sip. "She's been all right about harder things than this." Outside, the flatbed truck was gone, and the Chevy sat in Delbert's driveway, stripped to its bones and waiting. It had waited 18 years in the back of an auction lot. It could wait a little longer. In the garage, 2 men worked by lamplight while the Nebraska summer settled into dark around them, and somewhere in the spiral notebook on the sawbuck, a list of what needed doing grew longer and more specific with each hour, which was not discouraging but the opposite of discouraging, because a specific problem is a problem that can be solved, and Delbert Pruitt had learned from his father that the only machines that could not be fixed were the ones that had been given up on entirely. This one had not been given up on. Not anymore. The engine fired on the 3rd attempt. Not a cough, not a false start. A real ignition, the kind that begins rough and uncertain and then finds its footing, the cylinders catching in sequence until the whole machine settled into a rhythm it had not known in 21 years. Blue smoke rolled from the exhaust pipe and hung in the still June air of the garage. The idle was uneven at first, surging and dropping, the carburetor hunting for its mixture. Then slowly, the way a man wakes from a very long sleep, it steadied. Orville Breckett was standing 3 feet back with a fire extinguisher in both hands. He had brought it without being asked. That was the kind of friend he was. He did not set it down for the first 2 minutes. Delbert sat behind the wheel and did not touch anything. He had learned this from Chester: when a machine you have rebuilt runs for the first time, you listen. You do not adjust. You do not intervene. You let it tell you what it needs, because a cold engine, finding its tolerances, has its own conversation to have, and the worst thing you can do is interrupt it. The smoke thinned, the idle smoothed. The inline six settled into a sound that Delbert recognized, the way you recognize a voice you have not heard in years, deeper than you remembered, but unmistakably itself. They listened to it run for 6 minutes. Delbert counted later because he had not been watching the clock while it was happening. Orville said afterward that he had counted 2 without meaning to. Then Orville said, "Your father would have liked hearing that." Delbert nodded once. That was all. From inside the house, Thelma heard the engine through the kitchen window. She did not come out to the garage, but she turned off the television and the house went quiet around the sound of the old truck running, and she sat at the kitchen table and listened for a while before she went back to what she had been doing. 1 year. That was how long it had taken to get from a seized block on a garage floor to an engine that ran. 311 evenings in the garage after dinner, most of them alone, some of them with Orville. 253 hours on the machines at Omaha Steelworks after his shift ended with a signed form in Roscoe Hatfield's desk drawer, holding Delbert personally responsible for any damage. That form existed because of a Tuesday in September 1989, 3 months into the project, when Roscoe had called Delbert into his office and closed the door. Roscoe Hatfield was 55 that year, a compact and deliberate man who had run the production floor at the plant for 11 years and who had a policy of not involving himself in the private business of his workers unless it arrived at his desk in writing. It had arrived at his desk in writing. "Delbert," Roscoe said, and set a single sheet of paper on the desk between them. No name on it. Typed, not handwritten, a complaint about the after-hours use of plant machinery for personal projects, citing fairness and liability. Delbert looked at the paper. He knew who had written it. Gary Phelps, a line operator who had been angling for after-hours machine time for months and had found Delbert in the way. Delbert did not say this. He waited. "I'm not questioning your work," Roscoe said. 19 years I know what you are, but I've got a piece of paper on my desk and I have to do something with it." He leaned back. "Sign a liability waiver, personal responsibility for any damage, and no work past 10 at night. That's what I can offer." Delbert picked up a pen from the desk. "Where do I sign?" Roscoe watched him. "You're not going to ask who filed it?" "No." "You know who it is?" "Yes." Roscoe was quiet for a moment. Then he pushed the form across the desk. "Sign there and there." Delbert signed. He worked from 6 until 10, 4 nights a week for 8 more months after that conversation, and he never damaged a machine, and he was never late leaving. He did the work that needed doing, and when it was done, the engine fired on the 3rd attempt on a warm Tuesday evening in June of 1990, and the smoke that came out of the exhaust pipe carried with it a year of evenings and a debt to a man who had died 12 years earlier, who had first shown him how these machines worked. Gary Phelps's name came back to Delbert 8 years later in the break room at the plant when Roscoe Hatfield set down his coffee and said, almost as an aside, "You hear about Phelps?" Delbert had not heard. "Let him go last week," Roscoe said. "Been taking stock from the materials room. Small amounts, years of it. Started around 89, 90, near as we can figure." He picked his coffee back up. "Funny how these things work out." Delbert said, "I didn't know." Roscoe looked at him carefully. "You knew who filed that complaint in 89. "Yes, and you never said anything." "It wasn't my place." Roscoe nodded slowly, the nod of a man revising an opinion he had already held in fairly high regard. He did not say anything more about it, and neither did Delbert, and that was the end of the subject between them. The years between 1990 and 2006 did not pass the way people imagine when they picture a long project. They did not blur. They accumulated specific and distinct, the way mileage accumulates on a truck you drive every day. You do not experience the miles as a total. You experience them as individual Mornings and evenings turns made and distances covered weather endured, and bypassed the odometer advancing one-tenth at a time. In the spring of 1991, Thelma told Delbert she was pregnant. They were sitting at the kitchen table after dinner, and Delbert looked at his wife and felt the specific grounded joy of a man who understands that his life is about to reorganize itself around something more important than anything he had previously arranged it around. Then Thelma said, "When the time comes, Delbert, which car are we taking to the hospital?" He understood the question precisely. They had one reliable vehicle, Chester's Dodge, and one vehicle that was operable but not yet proven over distance or weather, or the particular urgency of a 2 in the morning departure. The Chevy ran, but running in a warm garage under controlled conditions and running reliably under every condition were two different certifications. "I'll have it ready," Delbert said. "I know you will," Thelma said. "I'm just asking you to have it ready sooner." Delbert called Orville the next morning. "Are you free this weekend?" Orville said he was free both days. Delbert said, "Bring food. It's going to take longer than I think." Yeah. It's going to... They spent that entire weekend on the electrical system and the weekend after on the brake system, and by December, the Chevy was as road-ready as any vehicle Delbert had ever put his name to. But there was an evening in that December, a Tuesday, when Thelma had gone to bed early and the house was quiet, and Delbert was sitting in the garage with the overhead light on, not working, just sitting in the driver's seat of the Chevy with his hands on the wheel. He was not looking at the engine. He was looking at the house, at the yellow rectangle of the bedroom window where the light was still on. For the first time since the auction, the thought arrived uninvited and stayed long enough to be examined. Was he doing this in the right order? The garage had taken evenings. The machine work had taken nights. The weekends had been given over to this truck for 2.5 years, and Thelma had not complained, not once, and she was carrying their child, and that fact sat in Delbert's chest, not as guilt exactly, but as a weight that needed addressing. He got out of the truck, went inside, made 2 cups of tea, and brought one to Thelma. She was still awake reading. She took the tea. She looked at his face. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," he said. "I wanted to bring you tea." She looked at him a moment longer in the way she had of reading past what he said to what he meant. Then she moved over in the bed to make room, and he sat down on the edge, and they drank their tea without talking, and that was in its way the most important conversation they had that year. Glenda Pruitt was born in March of 1992 on a morning that arrived 3 weeks earlier than expected. Delbert drove to the hospital in the Chevy. It was 22 degrees and the roads had a thin skin of late winter ice, and the truck started without hesitation and ran without complaint for the entire drive. When he brought Thelma and Glenda home 2 days later, Thelma got into the passenger seat and sat for a moment looking through the windshield at the flat gray March sky. She put her hand on Delbert's leg. She did not say anything about the truck. She did not need to. In 1992, the Chevy became Delbert's daily driver. People in Omaha began to recognize it, which is something that happens in mid-sized American cities when a particular vehicle has been on the same roads long enough to become part of the landscape. The truck was not beautiful in any polished sense. The paint was still faded. The bed still had its dents. But it ran with a consistency that drew its own kind of attention, the attention people pay to anything that simply keeps doing what it is supposed to do year after year without drama. Eldon Cantrell still commented when he saw Delbert around town, though the comments evolved over the years in a way that told its own story. In the early 90s, it was still the direct challenge, still driving that museum piece Delbert ready for something real, yet by the mid-90s, it had become more performative, aimed at whoever happened to be nearby. By 1998, it was briefer, more rote, as though Eldon were honoring an obligation he had made to himself rather than genuinely engaging. Delbert's answer never changed. "Truck runs fine. It always did." There was an afternoon in 1995 that Delbert returned to more often than he realized. Glenda was 3 years old, and Delbert had brought her out to the garage on a Sunday not to teach her anything in particular, but because she had followed him and he had let her, and she had climbed up into the cab of the Chevy and settled herself in the driver's seat with the natural authority of a small child who has decided a place belongs to her. She put both hands on the wheel. She looked through the windshield at the garage wall. "Does this truck have a name?" she said. "Not yet." "Can I give it one?" "Go ahead." She thought about it with the seriousness that 3-year-olds bring to important decisions. "Blue," she said. Delbert looked at the faded gray primer paint. "It isn't very blue anymore." Glenda looked at the truck, then at her father with an expression of mild patience. "But it wants to be," she said. Delbert looked at the truck for a moment. Then he nodded. "Blue it is." He never called it anything else after that, though he never called it by name in front of other people either. It was a private name, the kind families have for things that matter to them. The summer of 2001 produced the moment that Delbert remembered, not because of what was said, but because of what was not. He was at a filling station on a Wednesday afternoon, and Eldon Cantrell pulled in driving a new F-150 Super Crew, the biggest version, the top trim, the kind of truck that had become the physical expression of Eldon's identity over the previous decade, a new one every year or so, each one larger and more equipped than the last. Eldon got out, saw the Chevy at the next pump, saw Delbert behind it. He looked at the truck. Then he said, "You're still driving that." Not a question, not a jab, just a statement of fact delivered with something in it that had not been there before, something that might have been recalibration. "Still runs," Delbert said. Eldon nodded slowly. "How many miles?" "About 95,000. Eldon said, He went inside to pay. When he came back out, he got in his truck and left without another word. Orville heard about it that evening on the phone. He was quiet for a moment, then, "He's starting to do the math." Delbert said he didn't know what that meant. Orville said, "He's sold probably 200 trucks in the last 10 years. He knows what 200 trucks cost over 10 years. And he's standing next to a 47-year-old Chevy that's still running. He's doing the math whether he wants to or not." Delbert thought about that for a while. Then he said, "I'm not trying to make a point." "I know you're not," Orville said. "That's what makes it a point." In 2004, Glenda was 12 and she had begun appearing in the garage on weekend mornings without being asked. Not to socialize, to work. Delbert had a project on the bench and Glenda had pulled up a stool and was watching with the focused stillness that he recognized from his own childhood, the posture of someone who is learning through observation before they are ready to ask questions. He handed her a tool. She took it. He showed her the direction. She adjusted. The second time she did it correctly on her own, and Delbert placed his hand briefly over hers and gave a single small turn of confirmation, the same gesture Chester had used with him, and Glenda nodded once and continued. Neither of them commented on the moment. It did not require comment. By spring of 2007, the Chevy had been Delbert's daily driver for 15 years. It had 170-some thousand miles on it, and it had never stranded him. He had changed the oil on schedule, adjusted the valves each year, replaced wear items as needed. The truck had held up its end of the arrangement without exception. It was in May of that year that he noticed the bed was sitting unevenly. Not dramatically, just a slight elevation on the driver's side, the kind of thing that most people would not see unless they were looking at the truck from directly behind. Delbert was looking from directly behind, and he saw it. He checked the bed mounts. They were sound. He checked the frame at the mount points. No flex, no distortion. He measured the bed's ride height on both sides and found a difference of approximately half an inch, which was not large but was consistent and unexplained. Then he replaced the rotted floorboards, and measuring for the new oak planks was when he found the first number that did not make sense. The outer bed length was 98 inches. The inner measurement from the front wall to the inside face of the tailgate was 94 inches. 4 inches of space that existed on the outside of the truck, but not on the inside. Delbert measured again, then a third time. He tried to account for wall thickness for the tailgate mechanism for any structural explanation that would make the number come out right. None of them worked. The 4 inches were simply not there. He tapped the front bed wall with his knuckle, the panel that ran across the width of the truck, between the bed and the back of the cab. The upper half returned a hollow sound. The lower half, below a line he could not see but could hear, returned a solid one. He stood in the bed of the truck for a long time. The afternoon was quiet. A neighbor's sprinkler ran somewhere down the block. He went inside and called Orville. "Come over," he said. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. I need you here." Orville arrived 40 minutes later, and Delbert showed him the measurements without explanation. Orville went through the same sequence Delbert had, checking and rechecking, tapping the wall, frowning at the numbers. Then he stood up straight and looked at Delbert. "Someone welded a false wall in there," Orville said. "That's what I think." "When?" "Not from the factory. The weld line is inside the bed, not in the seam. Somebody added it after." Orville looked at the front wall of the bed. "Why would somebody do that?" Delbert said, "That's the question." They stood there for a moment, both of them looking at the wall. When did you notice this? Orville asked. 3 days ago. You've been sitting on it 3 days. I wanted to be sure about the measurements before I did anything. Orville looked at him. And now you're sure? Yes. Orville looked back at the wall. Then he said the two words that Delbert had been waiting to hear, not because he needed permission, but because some moments require a witness. Cut it, Orville said. Delbert picked up the angle grinder. He worked along the lower edge of the false wall, following the weld seam, cutting slowly and without hurry. Metal smell, sparks in the small orange arcs. Orville stood back, hands at his sides, this time no fire extinguisher because this was not that kind of fire. When the last section of the weld gave way, Delbert set down the grinder and worked the panel free with his hands. It came out in one piece, a sheet of steel about 4 inches deep, running the full width of the truck, heavier than it looked. Behind it was a space. In the space was a bundle canvas wrapped around something. The canvas itself sealed inside a rubberized material that had kept out moisture and air for a very long time. Delbert reached in and pulled it out. It was heavier than he expected. He set it on the floor of the bed and looked at it for a moment. Orville did not say anything. Delbert did not say anything. 30 seconds passed. Orville said later it was the longest 30 seconds he could remember, the length of a breath held before something changes. Delbert opened the canvas. Inside was a metal box, the kind sold in hardware stores for decades as a fireproof document safe. It opened without a key, the lock mechanism corroded past the point of functioning. Inside the box was money. Old bills, nothing newer than 1969, the paper still supple from the seal of the container. 20s and 50s and hundreds bundled in rubber bands that had lost their tension but not their form. Delbert counted the money 3 times. Each time he reached the same total, $8,400. Under the money was a manila envelope. Inside the envelope were 2 items. The first was a land deed for 80 acres in Scottsbluff County in western Nebraska, dated 1968, signed and notarized, but never recorded or transferred to any county register. The second item was a letter handwritten on 2 pages of lined notebook paper in the careful, deliberate cursive of a man who had learned penmanship in school and practiced it his whole life. The date at the top of the letter was November 1971. Delbert sat down on the floor of the truck bed, his back against the side rail, the letter in his hands. Orville sat on the tailgate. Delbert read it aloud slowly because some things need to be heard as well as read. The man's name was Virgil Drummond. He had worked pipeline jobs across Nebraska and Wyoming and the Dakotas from 1952 to 1968. 16 years of overtime and double shifts and holidays and every other hour he could accumulate, sending home what his family needed and saving the rest in cash because he did not trust banks with money he had worked that hard to make. He had never told his wife Laverne about the savings because Laverne had a talent for living that expressed itself in new curtains and furniture and the kind of household comfort that money passed through on its way to being gone. And Virgil had wanted to give her something better than curtains, something that would last. In 1968, he had found the land, 80 acres in Scottsbluff County, near the North Platte River, rolling grassland with good water access, in a view west toward the Wyoming border that Virgil described in 2 sentences that told Delbert this man had stood on that ground and felt something he did not have words for, except to say it was everything he wanted. He had bought it with cash. He had not told Laverne. He had been planning to retire in 1972 and drive Laverne out to Scotts Bluff and show her the land and the plan, the cabin he had drawn on the back of a gas receipt, the garden spot he had already picked out, the fishing hole on the east bank of the river that held trout in the summer. He had been going to show her all of it at once, the whole picture, because he understood Laverne well enough to know that a dream revealed in pieces would not land the same way as a dream revealed complete. But the doctor had told him in October of 1971 that his heart was failing and that retirement in 1972 was probably not going to be part of his story. The money was clean, Virgil wrote. Every dollar of it earned, honestly documented if anyone cared to look. The land deed was legal. The title was clear. He had simply run out of time to complete the transaction he had spent 16 years preparing. He wrote, I figured whoever cared enough to fix this truck and keep it running deserved what I left inside it. The land is good, wide open, quiet. Everything I wanted for the 2 of us. I'm sorry I kept secrets. I was trying to give her something better. I just ran out of time. He signed it with his full name, Virgil E. Drummond. November 1971. When Delbert finished reading, he folded the letter along its original creases and held it in his hands and looked out from the truck bed at the back wall of his garage. The workbench, the tool chests, the coffee can of pencils and markers on the shelf, the ordinary inventory of a working life. Orville sat on the tailgate without speaking for a while. Then he said quietly, he worked 16 years for a dream his wife didn't know about. He wanted to surprise her. Orville was quiet for another moment. Then, or he wanted to have something that was only his until he could share it whole, something that hadn't been talked through and compromised and adjusted, just his until it was ready. He looked at the letter in Delbert's hands. I think both things are true, and I think that's a sad kind of way to love somebody, even when you mean it well. Delbert said nothing, but he thought about that all night. He spent the following 2 weeks in the county records. Virgil Drummond, deceased February 1972. Age 59, cause of death listed as myocardial infarction. Laverne Drummond had sold the truck to an estate liquidator, and in March of that year, 4 weeks after the funeral, she had moved to Phoenix, Arizona in May. She had died there in 1984. No children, no siblings surviving, no heirs identified in any county record Delbert could locate. The 80 acres in Scottsbluff County had never been transferred. They sat in Virgil Drummond's name in the county records like a sentence that had been started and never finished, accumulating years of unpaid property tax until the county had eventually reclassified the parcel as unclaimed property, which meant it existed in a legal condition somewhere between ownership and abandonment, waiting for someone to make a claim. Delbert sat with all of this information for 2 days, not deciding, processing. He knew in a factual and uncomplicated way that he could put the money back in the box back behind the wall, and reinstall the floorboards and drive the truck until the end of his life, and no one would ever know anything about Virgil Drummond's 16 years of double shifts or the 80 acres sitting unclaimed by the North Platte River. He also knew in an equally factual and uncomplicated way that he was not going to do that. On a Thursday morning in October of 2007, he called a lawyer named Dewey Haskell, whose name he had gotten from a man at the plant who said Dewey knew Nebraska property law better than anyone in Omaha and had been practicing long enough to have seen everything. Dewey Haskell was 67 thin, with white hair cut short and thick-framed glasses that had been out of style for 20 years and which he showed no intention of updating. His office on the second floor of a building near the courthouse was the kind of office that accumulates over decades of practice, every flat surface occupied by stacked files and reference books and yellow legal pads covered in handwriting that made Delbert's own look casual. Dewey heard the whole story without interrupting. When Delbert finished, Dewey took off his glasses, cleaned them on his shirt, put them back on, and looked at Delbert across the desk. I'm going to ask you a question that I would not normally ask a client, Dewey said. You could keep that money and walk away. The land is unclaimed property, complicated, probably takes months to resolve if you pursue it, and there's no guarantee it comes to you rather than the state. The cash is sitting in your garage, and no one knows about it except you and Orville Breckett. Why are you here? Delbert said, because it isn't mine. Legally at this point, that is not entirely clear. Legally and correctly aren't always the same thing, Delbert said. Virgil Drummond worked 16 years for that money and bought that land and never got to use any of it. The least I can do is make sure the paperwork gets done right. Dewey looked at him for a long moment. Then he picked up a legal pad and uncapped his pen. It will take approximately 9 months, Dewey said. It will cost you around $2,000 in fees. And there is a real possibility that the land reverts to the state rather than being awarded to you. He wrote something at the top of the page. You understand all of that, Bill? Yes. And you want to proceed? Yes. Dewey wrote for a moment. Then without looking up, I've been doing this for 35 years. I've seen a lot of people sit in that chair. Most of them come in here because they want something. You came in here because you think something should be done correctly even if you don't benefit from it. He looked up. That's not common. Delbert said, it's just how I was raised. Dewey nodded once and they got to work. That November, Delbert moved the metal box from the truck bed to the shelf in his garage next to Chester's tool chest and the green maintenance log from 1975. He did not hide it. He set it in plain sight on the shelf where he could see it every time he went into the garage. Every morning that fall and winter, before he drove to work, he would stop for a moment and look at the box and the envelope beside it and think about Virgil Drummond. 59 years old, writing a letter by hand on a November night in 1971. Knowing he was running out of time, tucking it behind a false wall, he had built himself in the bed of a truck. He trusted more than most people he knew. Delbert was 59 years old that year. He never mentioned that to anyone. Not to Thelma, not to Orville, not to Dewey Haskell. But the number sat with him all through those months, specific and quietly insistent, the way certain facts arrange themselves in your mind, not as coincidence, but as instruction. Virgil Drummond had run out of time at 59. Delbert Pruitt was 59, and whatever time he had remaining, he intended to use it finishing something a man he had never met had started long before. The only question was whether the law would let him. Dewey Haskell called on a Tuesday morning in February of 2008 at 8 minutes past 8. Delbert was at the kitchen table with his coffee when the phone rang. He looked at the number picked up and said nothing. He had learned over the previous 9 months that Dewey Haskell did not call with partial information. When Dewey called, something had been decided. "It's done," Dewey said. There was a pause, the pause of a man who has chosen his next words carefully. 80 acres in Scottsbluff County, legally transferred to Delbert Pruitt, recorded in clear. Another pause. "I've been practicing property law for 35 years. This is the second time I've seen land wait for the right person." He stopped. The first time was 1987. That man also didn't come to me because he wanted something. Then Dewey hung up. No congratulations, no ceremony. Just the facts delivered by a man who had spent a career understanding that the facts were enough. Delbert set the phone on the table. Thelma was standing at the counter with her back to him, and she turned when she heard him set the phone down. She read his face. "The land, it's ours." She did not say anything immediately. She came to the table and sat down across from him, and they looked at each other across the coffee cups in the morning quiet of a house that had held this waiting for 9 months. Then Thelma said, "Virgil Drummond would be glad." She said his name the way people say the names of those they have known, not the way people refer to strangers. Virgil Drummond had become someone Thelma Pruitt knew without having met him, the same way you come to know anyone whose life runs long enough through the edges of your own. Delbert picked up his coffee. "I want to go see it." "I know. I want us all to go." Thelma looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "When?" "March, before the weather turns." "I'll tell Glenda." Glenda was 16 that year, a junior in high school who spent her free periods in the shop class and her weekends in the garage, and who had recently informed her parents that she intended to study mechanical engineering at the University of Nebraska, a decision that surprised neither of them. She received the news of the Scotts Bluff trip with the focused interest of someone who has been following a long story and is ready to see the place where it happened. They left Omaha on a Saturday in late March, all 4 of them, in the Chevy Delbert, and Thelma in front Orville, and Glenda in the back. For the first 20 miles, Delbert listened to the engine with the habitual attention of a man who trusts but verifies. It ran without complaint. It ran the way it always ran, steady and undemonstrative, as though the distance were a minor consideration. The landscape west of Omaha opens up gradually, and then somewhere past North Platte, the character of the land changes in a way that is difficult to describe but unmistakable when you feel it. The sky becomes a more significant part of the view. The horizon moves back. The grass along the roadside takes on a different texture, shorter and more resilient, shaped by wind rather than cultivation. No one said much for the middle 2 hours. The radio found a country station out of Grand Island and then lost it somewhere past Kearney and did not find another. No one reached to look for one. Orville had brought a thermos of coffee and passed it forward twice without being asked. Glenda fell asleep against the window somewhere around Ogallala and woke up when the truck slowed onto the county road that led to the parcel. Delbert turned onto the dirt track that bordered the property's eastern edge and stopped the truck at a gap in the fence line where a gate had once been. He turned off the engine. They all got out into the March cold, which was serious cold out here, the kind with a wind component that makes you understand why the people who settled this country had a particular quality of stubbornness. Delbert walked ahead of the others. Not far, just far enough to stand alone in the first 50 yards of the property in the knee-high grass that had gone brown and flat for winter, but would come back in May, and knew it. To the west, the North Platte ran in a slow, cold curve, the water low from winter, but present and clear. Beyond it, the land rose gradually toward a skyline that had nothing on it, no structure, no tower, just a clean edge of ground meeting sky. He stood there for a long time. He thought about Virgil Drummond on a pipeline cruise somewhere in the Wyoming high country in the late 1950s, pulling a double shift in January, weather keeping in his mind some image of this exact ground, the way a man keeps a photograph returning to it when the work was hardest. 16 years of that, 16 years of the image maintained and the money accumulated and the plan held close, and then a doctor's office in October 1971 where the plan ran out of runway. He thought about Chester Pruitt in a garage at 11 at night rebuilding a carburetor that did not need rebuilding, teaching his son that the honest relationship between a man and a machine was one of the few arrangements in the world that could not be corrupted by circumstance or other people's opinions. He thought about a 3-year-old girl saying the truck wanted to be blue. Thelma came to stand beside him. She did not ask what he was thinking. She put her hand through his arm and looked out at the same view. Delbert said, "He worked for this. He stood here once in 1968 and bought it and drove home and didn't tell anyone. He carried it by himself." Thelma said, "He couldn't share it until it was whole." Orville said the same thing. Orville was right. She looked at the river. The question is what we do with it now. Delbert had been thinking about that for months, and he had an answer. But he had waited to say it here on the ground itself because some decisions want to be made in the place they concern. "I want to keep 40 acres, build something on them, small, something Virgil would have recognized." He paused. "And I want to sell the other 40 to whoever will take care of the land." Thelma was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "And the cabin, you want to build it where he would have built it?" "Yes, then we build it where he would have built it," Thelma said. "And Glenda gets summers out here." Behind them, Glenda had walked to the fence line and was looking south along the river, her hands in her jacket pockets, her engineer's eye already measuring something. Orville stood near the truck with his thermos, giving the moment its space, which was exactly what Orville had always known how to do. The rancher's name was Harlan Cavender, 55 years old, third-generation cattle operation on land his grandfather had homesteaded. He came to meet Delbert at the county recorder's office in Scotts Bluff, a large man in a canvas coat with the particular physical confidence of someone who works outdoors in all weather and has stopped noticing it. Cavender wanted all 80 acres. He made that clear before he sat down. 40-acre parcel by itself doesn't have the same value as part of a full section. "I'll give you 110 for the whole thing." He said it not unkindly, the way experienced negotiators deliver their opening position. Delbert said, "I'm keeping the North 40. Cavender looked at him. "For what purpose?" "Personal use." "You from Omaha?" "I am." "You going to run cattle on it?" "No." Cavender leaned back. "Then it's going to sit. A 40-acre parcel with no road access, no water infrastructure, used for nothing. That's a waste of good ground." Delbert said, "There's road access on the north edge, and the river provides water access." "You've been out there." "Last month." Cavender was quiet for a moment, reassessing. Then he said, "I'll give you 115 for the full 80. Final offer." Delbert said, 95 for the south 40. "That's what I'm selling." They looked at each other across the county recorder's desk. Cavender said, "You're not going to move on this." "No." Cavender was quiet for another moment. Then he said, 95 for the south 40, and extended his hand. They shook. The transaction was recorded that afternoon. Delbert used the money to pay off the house in Omaha, which cleared a weight from the household finances that had been present so long it had become structural, something you stopped noticing until it was gone. Thelma said nothing about the amount and everything about the expression on Delbert's face when he called the mortgage company and listened to the balance read back at zero. The $8,400 in Virgil Drummond's box, Delbert did not keep. Virgil had served in the Navy during the Korean War 2 years on a destroyer escort in the Sea of Japan, and the Nebraska Veterans Association ran a fund that provided direct assistance to veterans and their families throughout the state. Delbert sent the money in a single cashier's check with a letter explaining only that it had been given by a veteran who would have wanted it used this way. He did not include his name. The construction of the cabin took parts of 2 years. Delbert did not rush it, and he did not overcomplicate it. He hired a local crew for the foundation and the framing, and he and Orville did the finish work themselves over 3 summers of long weekends and the occasional full week when they could arrange it. Glenda came out the summer she turned 17 and spent 2 weeks helping with the interior, learning to run trim and fit window casings with the same focused attention she brought to everything mechanical. She asked questions Delbert had not been asked before, and some that he had, and he answered all of them with the same directness Chester had used with him, giving her the full explanation rather than the simplified one, because she was capable of the full explanation, and he had always believed that people should be given what they were capable of receiving. The cabin was 1 story, 3 rooms, and a covered porch. The porch faced west toward the river and the Wyoming border beyond it. Delbert had oriented it that way without discussing it with anyone, because Virgil had written about wanting to sit and look west and watch the light change on the water in the evenings. And Delbert had understood from 30 years of working with tools that form a follows function, and the function here was a specific view. Orville stood on the finished porch on a September afternoon in 2009, holding a cup of coffee, looking at the river. He said, "You know what I keep thinking about?" "What?" "That this is exactly what he pictured, Virgil. This is it." Delbert leaned against the porch railing. "I thought so too." "How do you know you never met him?" "He described the fishing hole on the east bank. That bend in the river, right there." Delbert pointed. "That's the only spot on this stretch where the bank is flat enough to stand and cast." He knew this ground. He wasn't imagining a place. He was remembering it. Orville looked at the bend in the river for a long time. Then, "He only came out here once, in 1968. Apparently once was enough." Orville nodded slowly. "Some things you only need to see once." Delbert retired from Omaha Steelworks in June of 2010 and moved to the cabin in July, the Chevy loaded with tools and kitchen items, and 2 chairs that had been in the Prewitt house since 1979. Thelma stayed in Omaha through the fall while Glenda finished her senior year, then sold the house and came west in November, arriving at the cabin on a gray afternoon with 2 carloads of boxes and the particular efficient calm of a woman who has been planning a move in her head for some time and is pleased to find it going according to plan. She stood on the porch the first evening and looked at the river in the November light, which was flat and silver, the cottonwoods along the bank stripped bare for winter. Delbert stood beside her. She said, "It's better than I expected." Delbert said, "It gets better in May." "I imagine it does," Thelma said, and went inside to start dinner. The years at the cabin accumulated in the way that good years do not, in dramatic episodes, but in the texture of daily life, early mornings with coffee on the porch, the river changing color with the seasons, Glenda's visits in summer that grew longer after she graduated, and shorter again when her career began but never stopped entirely. Orville came twice a year driving out from Omaha, staying in the small guest room, and sitting on the porch in the mornings without much need for conversation, which was the mark of a friendship long past the stage of requiring maintenance. Delbert drove the Chevy to town once a week for supplies and to the summer car shows in Scotts Bluff, where it attracted the attention that old trucks in good running condition always attract a mix of nostalgia and genuine appreciation from people who understood what it meant for a vehicle to have lasted this long. He received offers regularly. He declined them all briefly and without elaboration. The truck was not for sale. That was the end of the conversation. In December of 2009, Orville had called from Omaha to tell Delbert that Cantrell Ford had closed. The dealership had been over-leveraged going into the recession, the inventory too heavy, the property debt too large, and when the credit markets tightened, there was nothing to cushion the fall. Eldon had lost the dealership in the building, and from what Orville had heard, the house as well. Orville had expected some reaction from Delbert. What he got was a pause and then, "Is he all right?" Orville said, "You're asking me if Eldon Cantrell is all right. He's a person. He made your life difficult for 20 years. He made comments," Delbert said. "That's different from making my life difficult." Another pause. Orville said, "Word is he landed a sales manager job at a Ford store in Lincoln." "Good," Delbert said. That was the end of the conversation about Eldon Cantrell. Not because Delbert was suppressing something, but because there was genuinely nothing more to say. A man's business had failed in a bad economy, and he had found other work, and that was a story that had played out for a lot of people in those years, and required no particular commentary from Delbert Pruitt. The building where Cantrell Ford had stood on Dodge Street in Omaha was a tire service center now. The large sign with the blue Ford oval was gone. The service bays ran on a different schedule for a different purpose. Nothing that had made the place what it was under Eldon's ownership had survived the transition. He was 76 years old in the summer of 2024 when he drove the Chevy to the annual car show at the Scottsbluff Fairgrounds on a Saturday in July. Glenda was with him. She was 32 now, a mechanical engineer with a firm in Lincoln home for 2 weeks. And she had her grandfather's hands and her father's way of being quiet in a crowd, which was to say she was fully present without requiring attention. The Chevy was parked in the classic row between a 1957 Ford and a 1961 Corvette, whose owner had spent more money on paint than Delbert had spent on everything in the past decade. The Chevy looked exactly like what it was, a truck that had been well maintained, but not restored to showroom condition, its paint still carrying the decades-long fade from Chevy blue toward gray, its bed showing the honest marks of use. Among the trailered and polished machines around it, it had a different quality, the quality of something that had actually lived its life rather than been preserved from it. An older woman approached from the left, moving with the unhurried pace of someone who is not in any particular direction. She had white hair cut short, a light jacket despite the July heat, and she was looking at the truck before she reached it, looking at it with a specific attention that was not the general appreciation of a car show visitor. She stopped 10 feet away and looked at the front grille, the hood ornament, the curve of the fender. Then she said, "That's a beautiful truck. My late husband had one exactly like it. Blue." She paused. He loved that truck more than most things. Delbert turned to look at her. He said, "What was your husband's name?" She met his eyes. "Virgil Drummond. He passed in 1972. I sold his truck a few weeks after." She looked back at the Chevy. "I always felt bad about that. He would have wanted it kept." The world did not slow down. The fairground noise continued. The other visitors moved past. The July sun remained where it was. But Delbert felt something shift in his chest, the sensation of a very long line of events arriving at a point of completion. He said, "Ma'am, I bought this truck in 1989 at an estate auction in Omaha." He paused. "This is Virgil's truck." She looked at him. She looked at the truck. She looked back at him. "I'm sorry," she said. "What did you say?" "This is your husband's truck. I've been driving it for 35 years. Her name was Laverne Caldwell. Now, she told him, remarried in 1985 to a retired school teacher named Gerald, who had died 4 years ago. She had moved back to Nebraska after that to be closer to a niece in Omaha, and the niece had brought her to the car show today on a general outing, not knowing what they would find there. Glenda brought 3 chairs from the back of the truck without being asked and set them in the shade beside the vehicle. The 4 of them sat down, the 2 older people, and Glenda and Laverne's niece, who stood a little apart and understood without being told that she should. Delbert told Laverne everything. He did not abbreviate. He told her about the auction, about the $300, and the laughter about 19 months of rebuilding the engine. He told her about 16 years of driving the truck every day. He told her about the floorboards in the spring of 2007 and the 4 missing inches and what was behind the false wall. He told her about the money and the land and the letter. Laverne sat in her chair and listened to all of it, her hands folded in her lap, her face composed with the practiced stillness of someone who has already survived the worst news of their life and knows that whatever comes next, they can hold it. When Delbert mentioned the letter, she closed her eyes briefly. When he said Virgil had asked him to tell her he was sorry for keeping secrets and that he had been trying to give her something better. She opened her eyes and they were full, though nothing spilled. She held herself very still. Delbert reached into the breast pocket of his shirt and took out a folded piece of paper. It was a photocopy, the original safely held at the cabin, and the copy had been folded and unfolded enough times that the paper had gone soft at the creases. He had carried it for 17 years in various shirts and jacket pockets, not as a relic but as a fact he wanted to keep close, the way you keep a measurement you might need to reference again. He held it out to her. Laverne took it with both hands. She unfolded it slowly. She read it once, and then she read it again, and the tears that had been held came down quietly 2 at a time, and she let them come without wiping them away because some moments should not be managed. Glenda looked at her father. Delbert shook his head once gently. They waited. After a long time, Laverne folded the letter back along its creases and held it in her lap. She looked at the Chevy. "He was saving for us," she said. "I knew he was saving something. He was always too careful with money for a man who made good wages, but I never pressed him. I thought it was his business to tell me when he was ready." She stopped. And then he wasn't ready, and then he was gone, and I always thought I had missed something, that there had been something he wanted to say, and I had somehow not made enough room for it. Delbert said, "He made room for it. He wrote it all down." "I know that now. He said the land was beautiful. He said it was everything he wanted for both of you." Laverne looked at him steadily. "Was it?" "Yes," Delbert said. "I've lived on it for 14 years." She looked at him for a long moment. "You built the cabin." "On the North 40, facing west toward the river. He used to say he wanted to sit on a porch and watch the light change on the water in the evenings. He said that when we were first married. I hadn't thought about that in years." She looked down at the letter in her lap. He remembered it his whole life. "The porch faces the bend in the river," Delbert said. "The fishing hole on the east bank is exactly where the letter says it is." Laverne was quiet. Then she said, "Can I ask you something?" "Yes." "Why did you do all of this, the legal work, the land, the cabin? You could have kept the money and said nothing. No one would have known." Delbert considered the question the same way he considered every question, directly and without hurry. "Virgil worked for that land and never got to stand on it. The least I could do was make sure somebody did, and somebody finished what he started." Laverne looked at the truck, then at Delbert. She said, "Virgil would have liked you. He trusted the kind of person who would take care of his truck." Delbert said, "I was just trying to be that person." "You were," Laverne said. "Exactly that." She asked to see the cabin, and they arranged it for the following afternoon. Laverne and her niece drove out on the county road while Delbert came in the Chevy, and they stood on the porch together in the late July afternoon and looked at the North Platte moving slow and clear in its summer shallow, the cottonwoods full and green, the light doing exactly what Virgil Drummond had imagined it doing when he stood on this ground in 1968 and decided to spend 16 years buying it. Laverne did not cry on the porch. She stood quietly for a long time, taking it in with the attention of someone who is trying to memorize something. Her niece stood near the door. Glenda was at the edge of the porch watching the river. Delbert stood a few feet away from Laverne, giving her the space the moment required. After a while, Laverne said, "He vowed to bring me somewhere like this. On our honeymoon, 1948. He said someday he was going to take me somewhere the sky was big." She looked at the horizon. "He found it." Delbert said nothing. "And you finished it," she said. "You built what he drew." "I built what I thought he would have built." She turned and looked at him with an expression that was past gratitude, something quieter and more complete. "He chose the right truck to put it in," she said. "He knew whoever took care of that truck would be the kind of man who did things right. He was betting on a stranger." She paused. "He won." In Delbert's garage next to the cabin, the Chevy sat in the same space it occupied every night. 180,000 miles on the odometer, accumulated over 35 years of daily use. And the engine that Delbert had rebuilt by hand in a borrowed corner of a steel plant ran with the same character it had found on the evening it first fired in 1990. He changed the oil on schedule. He adjusted the valves each year. He replaced things when they needed replacing and did not replace them before. A collector from Denver had offered $28,000 the previous summer at the Scotts Bluff show, a serious offer from a man who knew what he was looking at. Delbert had thanked him and declined. The truck was not for sale. It had never been for sale. Glenda came back to the cabin in the summer of 2023 for 3 weeks, the longest visit in several years. On a Thursday afternoon, they were in the workshop, Delbert adjusting the valve clearances on the Chevy with Glenda handing tools when she said, "Dad, what are you going to do with the truck eventually?" Delbert did not look up from what he was doing. "Drive it." "I mean after." He straightened up, set the tool down, looked at his daughter. She was 31 years old with her grandmother's dark eyes and her grandfather's patience and the specific competence that comes from having been taught by people who took the teaching seriously. "I thought maybe you'd want it," he said. Glenda looked at the truck. She ran her hand along the edge of the engine bay the way she had been doing since she was old enough to reach it. "I'd keep it running," she said. "I know you would, and I'd drive it." "I know that too." She looked at her father. "Did you know when you bought it that it would end up meaning this much?" Delbert picked the tool back up and went back to the valve he had been working on. "I knew it had been waiting a long time," he said. "I knew it was built well. Beyond that, no." Glenda watched him work. "Virgil Drummond knew something about you before you knew it about yourself." Delbert was quiet for a moment, making the adjustment, checking it. "He didn't know me. He trusted a type." "He was right about the type." Delbert set the tool down again. He looked at the truck, at the faded paint, and the honest dents in the grille ornament that Glenda had once said the truck wanted to be blue. And he thought about all of the mornings he had walked into a garage and seen it there across every decade of his adult life, and how the sight of it had never once felt routine. He thought about Virgil Drummond packing that box in November of 1971, sealing the canvas against moisture, welding the panel in place with a craftsman's precision, trusting the machine to keep the secret until the right person arrived. He thought about Chester in a garage at 11 at night, teaching his son to listen to what machines had to say. He thought about Orville standing with a fire extinguisher on a warm evening in 1990, and Thelma putting her hand on his leg on a cold March morning, and a 3-year-old girl telling him a faded gray truck wanted to be blue. He thought about Laverne Caldwell standing on a porch in July, looking at a river her husband had described to her in 1948 and found for her in 1968 and never managed to show her, and the way she had stood there quietly taking it in and said he found it. Virgil Drummond had run out of time at 59. Delbert Pruitt was 76 and still had a truck that started on the first try every morning, and a porch that faced west, and a daughter who would keep the engine running after he was gone. That was not luck. That was the accumulated result of not giving up on things that were built well. He picked the tool back up. "Hand me the feeler gauge," he said. Glenda handed it to him without comment. They worked together in the quiet of the workshop while the July afternoon moved toward evening outside the North Platte, running in its steady way past the bend, where the fishing was good, the light doing what Virgil Drummond had always believed it would do if someone gave it the right place to land. The truck was 70 years old and it still ran. It would run tomorrow. It would run after that. The things that are built honestly and maintained faithfully do not quit simply because time passes. They carry what they carry and they keep going, and sometimes what they carry is more than anyone knew when the journey started. That was what Virgil Drummond understood when he welded that panel into place and trusted a stranger he would never meet. That was what Chester Pruitt understood when he took his son into a garage at 11 at night and taught him to listen. That was what Delbert Pruitt understood when he paid $300 for something a crowd of men thought was worth $50 in scrap. Not a bad return on $300. Not a bad return at all.